Glember, The Tale of a Monster. Written, recorded, and illustrated by A.K. Brookman. Chapter 18, Glember's Song, continued. Day 47. When morning came, I felt more renewed than I'd anticipated. Still, I was unsure of my next move. Glember lay motionless, and only shallowly did his chest rise and fall. Around us, great sun-whitened boulders lifted from the moist green earth. It was as though this place was a grave for the crumbling mountain-tops lifting skyward all around us, and although these great rocks were towering in height, they were nothing like the mountains. And while their sizes varied, it seemed there was but one way through the maze of rock. Ahead, a narrow passageway led between two of these jutting rocks. I could not see what lay beyond, for the earth lifted in the central location. I wondered if at one time this place lay below the waters, though I could not discern why such a thought came to me. I struggled greatly to hoist and pull Glember over and through the craggy way leading to the narrow pass, but managed by mid-morning to get there. I wanted to leave Glember behind for a while and race ahead to see if the way was easier beyond, yet part of me knew this curiosity alone was ushering me onward. Without it, I feared I would have no motivation at all. I wanted to believe that it was something glorious, that I would find swift passage awaiting me, even if it was but a wakeful dream. As we entered the clearing, I gasped. Great stone dragons lay perched here and there on both sides of the ravine. There were many, many of them, of various rock-hued shades and sizes. I was seized with terror, unable to back away as I wished, and it was only after the moments slipped by that I broke free to turn and gaze down upon Glember at my feet. He suddenly opened his eyes. It was the first time he had all morning. "Help me to sit up, human," Glember whispered weakly. "Let me see what you see." I turned toward the great stone dragons. They were only moving very slowly, as though the wind were shifting them about. I could hear cracks and the fall of stones as they danced and tumbled their way down from the great boulders upon which these giant beasts were perched. And then I turned back toward Glember. I wanted to simply describe it to him, yet I could not find the words. I'd never seen anything like it, and I was much too horrified to utter a single word. Instead, I lifted Glember up as he requested, so that he could see ahead at what I happened upon. He remained sitting there, looking ahead, only slowly moving his gaze over the rocks and dragons ahead. It seemed as though he nodded, but I could not be sure. It was a subtle movement that may have only been his weariness. Or did he recognize this place, these mystical, terrifying creatures? As I turned back toward the clearing ahead, its boastful, boulder-lined wall on either side, I found every one of the dragons had turned our direction. It was more than a mild curiosity they were regarding us with. Suddenly, a breeze swept by, and the leaf-woven hat I'd made to protect myself from the sun was swept up in the gale. It tumbled forward, and I took a few steps toward it out of instinct, knowing Glember was able to support himself now that he was sitting upright, and then I realized what I had done. "Glember," I began. I stopped dead in my tracks. I could not convince myself to take another step. "Glember," I whispered, looking slowly back toward him. Glember looked past me, out at the great stone dragons, taking a moment to fix his gaze in each direction from one to the next. The dragons remained motionless for the most part, their massive heads swaying sullenly, although they turned their bodies as if to acquire a better view of the prey that happened into their nesting ground. For there were large and small alike amid this group, their eyes peering intently, their great claws gripping the stone. And then something happened I did not expect. There came a sound. I was not quite sure where it had originated. If you have climbed through the canyons and have sent your voice out into the rock, it comes back at you. It resonates from everywhere at once. The noise began soft, not unlike the hum of an instrument, and then it grew louder. I was stricken with fear, and yet I could not turn my mind from that sound. It echoed through me as the canyon. I could feel it in my feet, in my hands, and it moved through my chest. "Glember," I tried again, yet it had been taken by the lifting cry. I knew he could not hear me from where he stood, and then I noticed something. Glember was rising. He was swaying slightly from side to side, partly from his weakness, and yet it seemed somewhat purposeful, and I realized then that the song of the canyon came from him. His head drifted from one side to the next, and his arms moved only slowly, as though he was feeling the air for something unseen, or could feel something in that tense air. His voice rose and fell, and seemed to echo from here and there. It seemed as though the canyon began to sing with him, yet it was his voice alone, and there was sorrow in the resonation, there was triumph and failure, love and loss, hope and despair in it, and there was redemption. I'd never heard anything like it. It went on for some time until I felt very small and unworthy of the beauty of the world, and then he came to a still, and the song slowly waned until it was no more, the echo of the canyon carrying it a moment longer after the last utterance left Glember. There was an odd moment, an eerie time of silence, of motionless gazes. I felt as though Glember and these massive beasts understood something I could never understand, yet I was certain something sacred transpired. Glember had spoken to them. In the old high song of the past, Glember had spoken. It seemed to have taken everything out of him. He swooned, and only with the last of his strength managed to steady himself. What did he say? Now all was silent. And then Glember turned toward me. "Come, human," he said. "It is done." He seemed on the brink of death. "We may pass now," he said weakly. He was apparently unafraid of the giant dragons looming on both sides of the pass. I closed the distance between us. "What was that?" I asked. "What just happened?" Glember said nothing. His face looked much wiser than I remember before. These creatures of legend, said to devour entire villages, they simply... I could not find the words. "Let us pass?" I asked, staring at Glember directly. "Why do they not attack us now?" I wondered aloud. And still Glember said nothing. I could not discern whether it was reluctance to answer my question, or whether he was too weak to do so. "What will it matter in a few days?" I asked. "What matters it if I was going to die?" I asked. "What matters it when you now rest so close to death yourself, when we will both likely be no more very soon?" Glember looked into the distance ahead. He took in a breath that was meant to be deep, but was shortened by the weakness of his chest. "Stand beside me, and I will tell you," Glember said solemnly. I drew nearer, allowing him time to regain enough strength to speak, and yet I had begun to wonder whether he had changed his mind when he finally spoke. "The dragons never enter Gargle villages, and we, in turn, never enter theirs," he explained. "At least, when my people still were," he added mournfully. I had to lean closer to hear his soft words. "Under such circumstances as would require us to pass through each other's land, we seek safe passage from the other." "And that is what that song was?" I asked Glember, and he nodded. "Where did you learn it?" I asked him. "From my father, who learned it from his father, who learned it from his father, and so it has been for many generations." Glember answered. "Now," he said, "no more questions, human. You should be preparing your mind for what is to come. You've but a few days left, as you know." He winked and tried to smile, but it seemed the gesture itself pained him. How long did he have, I wondered. "Tell me what the song says," I inquired. "Tell me this, and I will remain silent." Glember shook his head, seemingly in disbelief. "You wouldn't understand, human," he said. "You don't even know what you are asking." I blinked and laughed. "Tell me, Glember," I demanded. It was no wonder where Lily received her stubborn, inquisitive nature from. Perhaps reluctantly, Glember gave in, and he relayed the song. I noticed a change in the tone of his voice. Perhaps I was winning him over after all. "Then listen, human," he said. "Hear the words of the song, and if you are to hear them, never forget them." I nodded my head, and so relayed Glember the last gargle. "So many of your people, so many of my people, down to their deaths where the shadows run over them. Yet the wind weeps for it, and the canyons weep for it, and we shall yet mix and join in the earth, as we once were joined, and shall be again. Now as the ancestors have spoken, in the times before dawns, I bid passage as they did, in the same voice, that we may honor this, just as they honored it, and so that our children may honor this, until the end of mornings." "Until the end of mornings," I whispered. Glember cast me his narrowed eyes, and I remembered the agreement. I would remain silent. How could I not, hearing the agreement just relayed and sent across the ages? Yet I could not escape the last line. I've mentioned this phrase before, you may recall. Or have you forgotten? Chapter 19, Dragonback and the Eterlions. Day 48. Glember had collapsed. He shook about violently, and blood began to trickle from his nose. He lay on the ground, jittering about oddly, and I could think of nothing to do. His limbs scraped against the earth without regard for the pain of it, and finally he came to stillness. I gave him some time. He was breathing weakly, his eyes opened only slightly, and he was gazing about as though he had no recollection of what had transpired or where he was. And then, in a singular moment of lucidity, he whispered, "Take me home," and then sleep reclaimed him. I had no way of knowing the patience of the dragons. I would not exhaust the limits of their hospitality by lingering, and so I lifted Glember up and began to walk. I was tired myself, and I cannot say how I managed to make it through that incredibly long pass. The dragons loomed over me on either side, and each step seemed a great struggle and an impossibly lengthy task, and although the ritual ascent seemed ages kept, I had the feeling the dragons looked down upon me with great curiosity, even disbelief. And although I prayed for the gift of haste, it was not granted. Times a moment seems an eternity. It was as though each footfall accompanied 1,000 slowly trickling beads of sweat down my face, and such shaking that I thought my limbs would rattle apart. Nevertheless, as I speak of it, so I endured it, and carried Glember through the pass in the hopes of taking him home. It was not until I thought I had that place left behind that a small dragon suddenly landed in front of me. I may describe it as small, though let this not deceive you with that this was no great creature. It was small in comparison to the others, yet it was many times my size. Likely its head was equal myself, should I cradle my limbs together. Night had sent out its minions, and the dragon approached, and I was in fear that our welcome had long expired when the creature scooped up Glember in such a way as to carefully place the gargle on its back. It was with some coaxing that I finally climbed atop the dragon too, finding its intent to assist, or at least hoping it so. When hope hides away, we find ourselves desperate. The massive beast, for all its strength, was not feasting upon us, though it easily could. I decided to trust it, and for once, such an action was not without reward. It carried us over terrain so rapidly, I was as amazed as I was terrified of its flight. It was midday when it descended, delivering us back to the ground and path. I had no way of knowing how much time we'd lost in our slow progression, nor how much time we gained with the dragon. I bowed in an attempt to thank the creature. I don't think it understood, but now it seemed much more curious of Glember, and even appeared reluctant to leave the gargle. Yet, after a stretch, it did, sailing back the way we had come, disappearing from us. "I guess this is as far as it could take us, Glember," I said. Glember did not answer. He had not stirred at all since he collapsed. I looked ahead and behind, finding the seldom used path vacant. I doubted another had placed a foot upon the path in a full cycle. The brambles were taking over, and, had it not been a fairly direct path, one would have easily lost its passage. Still, I dragged Glember from the path to rest, taking refuge among the nearby hedges. I would wait there until the 48th day expired. The dragon's gift was not without a fee, and every muscle in my body ached in protest to it. I could but clamp tightly for my life in fear for the entire duration of that ordeal, and now any movement was painful. I could not carry Glember further in such a state. In this way we rested until the morning of the 49th day came, sent its rays upon us. Day 49. My father used to say, when we speak with a grand vocabulary, we are only speaking to ourselves, no others. When we speak instead with the heart, then we speak directly to others. He would go on, if I open my mouth, it should be to communicate, or to convey, or, with care, to teach. Yet we can only teach if we respect, and we've only respect if we've trust, and we've only trust if we speak from the heart. So this is how we should begin and end communication, with honest words from the heart. And then he would ask, so how do we do this? And answer, we must forget our vocabulary. If you are thinking of your vocabulary during communication, you are only talking to yourself. You are only speaking for your own sake. You cannot convey compassion for the listener when speaking for yourself, and this will convey disrespect. And if you can forget your vocabulary, if you can say what you feel, not what you think or overthink, then you will communicate. This is why children are often better communicators than adults. A child will convey what he feels, not what he is taught. That is why we feel their profound cries, their honest inquiries, their raw emotions, and it is why our minds drift away from the lecturers and the drone of the men who recite the word books for their own ears. I've tried to relay this journey honestly then. There were trees and winds and scents and noises throughout the journey, yet these things do not convey the heart. They cannot communicate. Where is the validity of your time in my pointless wanderings among leaves and the sizes of structures along the way? If I subdue the tiny wrinkles around the eyes of another and the various hues or forms for your examination, would you be the better for it? Would it be the same as placing your hand upon the chest of another and feeling the beat of the heart therein? I think not. What is the world without the heart? It was the morning of the 49th day when I thought, should I live through this, I should say something about it, and I thought of my father's words. I removed my hand from Glember's chest. His heart was still beating. "Glember," I said. His eyes fluttered. Perhaps I should let him sleep, I decided. And then I thought, perhaps he should eat before he dies from the lack of nourishment. And as I stood to scan the area for signs of food, berries, animals, fruit, I saw the city. Was this Glember's home? Had we reached it at last? Had the dragon carried us in a day, what would have taken 10 or more on foot? And I shuddered as I thought of the Temple of the Eight Walls, the place where Glember had planned to kill me. Was the temple within? Was the place of my death to be that of Glember's? What was the city like? It was a village like other villages, like your village or my village. It held cottages and paths, a market square, a temple, and at one time, laughing children, mothers and fathers, and, like any place, the hope of the future. Most of these were gone now. No laughter echoed from its ways. No children with earth covering their legs and sparkles in their eyes came rushing to greet us. No scent of baked bread came with its winds, nor hammer of the smithy rang from its halls. No creaky carts were pushed toward its square. I carried Glember into the city, and, not knowing what to do next, entered into one of the nearby dwellings and placed him upon the boards of what may once have been a bed. He would lay there for 3 days while I wandered about the city, found its aged well and some edible gourds growing over its roads. He would lay there while I listened to the winds alone moving through its shanties, bringing him food and water, for he had little more than the strength to eat and drink meager amounts before falling with sleep again. He would lay there while I wondered to myself as I moved through the quiet days, should I enter the Temple of the Eight Walls? Day 52. On the 52nd day, just when I expected Glember to begin recovering from his weaknesses, wounds, and injuries, he began to burn with fevers and sweats. He began vomiting and muttering incomprehensible words. At times, I thought he would burst into flames, and at others, he was as cold as snow-capped mountain rock. I had gathered enough food and water. I had walked through the city's ways and entered most of its dwellings, except the temple. I had constructed an idea of how the city worked, of what town life was like here, and even the characteristics of many of its families, or the families that once lived therein. The place was desolate and dry now, and I did not leave Glember's side that day. I feared it would be his last, that if I stepped out of that dwelling, I would return to find him lifeless, that I would have to endure the thought of his lonely death. I argued with myself on whether to keep him responding now and then, even if it was little more than a mutter or an altered breath, or whether I should leave him alone and not ask of him any shred of strength more than that he required to endure, if he could. I paced back and forth beside that bed, stared at times out of its shutter-kept windows, and wondered why I was there at all. I had even begun to talk aloud to myself, perhaps to ward off insanity, perhaps because it had already seized hold of me. And then I quit speaking. For some odd reason, I suddenly had the feeling, after a strict denial for 3 days, that someone else was out there. It was the first time I suddenly began to think I was not alone, that I was perhaps being watched. I suddenly found myself disputing actions as a protector of Glember rather than thoughts of how to tend to him. And yet, the day sluggishly passed. The village remained quiet as our shadows stretched. Night fell. No one came to call. And as I sat on the floor with my back against the old bed and leaned my head over to rest it, sleep found me, and the 52nd day was done. Day 53. I heard birds on the morning of the 53rd day. It is odd the things we remember, those details our mind wrapped their recollecting arms around. The truth is, we cling to memories the way we cling to life. It is instinctual. We cannot often discern the difference, and when we feel the two are threatened, it is not unlike a storm. Most of the lessons of life come with a storm, and in these storms, the storms of the heart, we must turn to morality for guidance, else we lose our way, our memories, our lives, for naught. Glember's speech was discernible for the first time since his collapse this morning. I leaned against the bed, hearing his repetitive words. He wanted to be taken to the temple, and yet he was so weak. He remained sickly and groggy. I wouldn't allow it, and explained this. He continued to ask. I knew well how important it was to him, but for such a move, perhaps his last, most likely his last, I wanted him to have his strength. Day 54. Take me to the temple, human, Glember said. If you wait much longer, I shall perish. I was pacing. Why did he so desire to go there? Was it not the place where he intended to kill me? And why did it matter now? He could hardly lift any of his 3 fingers on either claw. He could hardly utter a word without great effort. He'd certainly not kill me, even had he the desire. And I had to own I was curious as well. What was all this for? Somehow, I knew some answer lay hidden within that structure. You are too weak, Glember, I said. The effort of it would be without merit, for you'd not handle the winds nor the expenditure. I wondered that he was holding on only for that moment alone, that if I prolonged it, he would get better. I was also apprehensive about the prospect. Was it a trick? Was it a trap? Not to mention the feeling that I was being watched had returned this morning, though it was gone the night before. Was it simply the fear of the inevitable, that eventually Glember was going to die, and I'd never understand his intent? The truth is, I was on edge. I wasn't certain I could ever make it home without Glember's aid. If I did this for him, would he help me get home to my family? Yet I couldn't escape the thought he planned to kill me there. And yet, the contraption he insisted would kill me never did. He had insisted I could end it any time by activating the mechanism, and yet, when this was done, nothing happened. It was as though he wanted me to discover this on my own, that he was testing me in some way. Did he really intend to teach me to overcome my fears, to stand unafraid of death? The final truth was, I don't know what any of this was all about. I had no clue. The most obvious things are right at your feet, he said to me once. Where were we then? What was at my feet then? Or now? See, I could not solve this riddle. The monster responsible for tearing me from my family, perhaps that would cost me my life, lay near death, and that part of me that wished to visit fitting retribution upon him, to usher in his death, could not overcome the other part, and I knew not what stood so stern within me as to defend him. Tomorrow, Glember, I said. I could hardly believe the words escaped my mouth. He tried to turn his head toward me, to catch my eyes, to seal this echo with the resounding bond of fate, yet he was too weak to turn toward me, and I did not make the effort to turn toward him, or to lean in close enough for him to see my eyes. Tomorrow, he whispered. It must have been enough, for he slipped away into sleep almost immediately. I walked to the shutters and peered out into the distance. What was out there? What awaited? You've just knocked out part 14 of 17 of Glember, The Tale of a Monster, which is the first book of the Meristherian Trilogy. Please subscribe and tell others about this site. I appreciate your support and time and hope you feel welcome here. Always invited to leave a friendly comment or question. I'll certainly try to keep up with these as regularly as I can. This is AK. Thanks for listening, friends, and see you next time.